DG Schengen-Fen, researchers at the IFPRI, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to have this dialogue and share some ideas with you. I was just explaining over lunch that just 2 hours ago I was doing something totally different. I was briefing a very powerful group of people in the US, policymakers in the US, on energy issues. That's really where I spend a lot of my time these days, leading energy issues within the United Nations. And so I'm very pleased to come back to base and talk a little bit about agribusiness. A few years ago, and for a while in fact, you know, when we talked about agriculture in Africa in particular, we always had this debate whether commercialization of agriculture will lead to food insecurity. So we had these silos of debates because people then associated commercialization with export agriculture and always the risk of food security. A friend of mine at Oxford University used to say to me a few years ago, he said, some of us in 70s, 80s vintage, he said, we like this happy peasant syndrome, that we can make African agriculture, families, you know, a husband, maybe 2, 3 wives, children helping on the farm. We can link them to global markets and make them happy. So he called it the happy peasant syndrome. I see new realities in Africa that makes it very important that we look at agribusiness. We accelerate Africa's entry into global markets, regional markets through agribusiness to tackle the challenge of fast growth, to tackle the challenge of job creation as well. And for sure, food security. And why do I say this? We get briefings from the IMF and World Bank twice a year. We, meaning the Secretary General and all UN chief executives in a closed room. We talk about global economics, global politics, insecurity, terrorism, the group. We had a briefing this year that was an eye-opener. The IMF was looking at the world 20 years from now. Where will be the population centers, the growth centers, the expenditure centers around the world? And here are numbers they gave us. They predict that in 20 years, you're going to have about 2 to 3 billion people moving into the middle and higher income brackets in emerging economies, mainly in Asia. And so they decided to disaggregate that. Where would be these locations? And they said, okay, let's take food. Let's leave out all the other consumers. Let's just take food. What will these people be consuming in 20 years? And they said, we compare that with Japan, Korea, and others when they made that transition, when their income levels hit $3,000, $5,000, $6,000 per head. What was the consumption pattern? So they went in, broke it down. Food, proteins. How do we produce? Where will be the production centers? So conclusion. They said to us in the briefing, the days of cheap energy are gone. The days of cheap food are gone. They said, but you know something? That population, 2, 3 billion, with purchasing power, they're going to need more televisions, more refrigerators, more of everything. So huge commodity demand. And the guy said, meanwhile, we have this other story of Africa hitting 1.4 billion people by 2030, about 2 billion, 2.5 billion by 2050. By 2030, over half of them in cities. Young men and women looking for jobs. Not enough energy to power those economies. That migration is preceding industrial transformation in those economies. In other parts, you had the industrialization moving, people moving into this. This one is preceding. So you see it in Freetown, you see it in Lagos and in Addis. What are we going to do? Will they afford food? Anyway, that's the context we are. That's why I believe this work is important. I put this team together about 4 or 5 years ago because I heard people talking about food security in the old style. These economies in Africa have to deal with food security, jobs, urbanization all at once today. And then you have the big risk multiplier, climate change, messing up everything. All the predictions, business as usual. Yields will go down by 50%. There will be climate refugees in Africa moving around because there's flooding and so on. How do you as a government deal with all of this today? If we just look at food security as just increasing production on the farm, you need to link farmers to markets. You need to have food distribution systems in the cities. You need to feed that population, but you need to create jobs. The Arab Spring is about jobs. I did a piece in March in Project Syndicate with the Minister of Trade and Industry of South Africa. We called it South of the Revolution. We were sitting in Algeria in March because we were there in Libya in November, watching everybody kissing Gaddafi. And then in March, we found ourselves there. And we said, could this happen down south? So we wrote this piece, and we wrapped this together. Agribusiness, jobs, and beneficiation, they call it in South Africa, adding value. So this book is about value addition. How do we begin to add value to Africa's production? To create jobs and wealth? How do we change the discussion in Africa from just poverty reduction to wealth creation? Because then you talk about competitiveness. Then you talk about trade. Then you talk about productivity and infrastructure. So it is that holistic approach that we really advocate for. A few years ago, this was the first report we did with Paul Collier and his colleagues at the Center for the Study of African Economies. The title is Industrial Development 2009, Development Report, Breaking in and Moving Up, looking at the bottom billion. Here we argue a lot about structural change, helping these economies move into labor-intensive production systems, which means you need the infrastructure, which means you need energy source. They must comply to international production and environmental standards in their production system. So the whole issue of sustainability in the presence of climate change that they're not guilty of, but they have to deal with because the impacts are there immediately on them. It is in that context we believed, as you look at structural change, that agribusiness is one of the most promising areas. You attack food security, you attack jobs, and the realization that our children are moving into the city. My last 2 points. Just to give the context, these colleagues will show you the pillars, the 7 pillars we've developed. The stories are not new. We're putting them together just to say, you better bring it back in the middle of the whole discussion. It's not either or. You must look at the business side and value addition and what will make it move in this current context. I was in China in August. I helped the Chinese organize an Africa-China Partnership for Investment Forum. In the middle of my speech, I stopped right at 7 minutes into the speech, and I stopped. And I said, I'm not going to read the official text anymore. I want to talk to you about the African dream, which is the subject of a new op-ed I'll release soon. From cocoa to chocolates. I say, you know, our dream, our children's dream, is to sell chocolates to 300 million Chinese. I'm not going to compete with Nestle or Cadbury. I just need 300 million middle-class Chinese to buy finished products from Africa. That's the dream. It's not to sell you cocoa, iron ore, and bauxite anymore. If that's the new market, it's the same thing we've done 600 years, and we're the poorest of the poor. Commodity trade makes you poor. Every nation has been able to do structural transformation, add value, industrialize, move up the ladder to create wealth. So it's not just that missionary thing of giving aid. It's about business models that will make agribusiness happen, and what would it take? It's about energy access and infrastructure to link markets and compliance to standards. Very crucial in today's situation. So I was surprised. I got an applause in China. I said, oh, I thought they would take it as an offense. No, that's the reality. If the new trade arrangements with Africa, with everybody, is just about iron ore, cocoa, and coffee, and oil and gas, and our people remain poor, there will be chaos. 1.4 billion people in 20 years. 2 billion. Talk about security. Lastly, this morning, I was dealing with the same issues with people from State Department, and there was an admiral in the room. And I talked about the Niger Delta in the same context. And he said, I agree with him. In fact, there are 5 of us generals who have our presentations looking at energy, security, lack of opportunity in some regions, and the potential for chaos. So I close by saying in Sierra Leone, we're very lucky. You know, in the last 2 years, we discovered oil. We discovered one of the 10 largest deposits of iron ore. And guess what? Thanks to WikiLeaks, we know we have uranium too. Thanks to WikiLeaks. We are 6 million. I say to Sierra Leoneans, you don't need aid from anybody in 10 years. You should be wealthy. Our children should be proud to come back and have real jobs, not charity. That's what we're talking about in this book. To take this discussion back, that our dream in Africa is not to sell cotton. To do cocoa, you pick it from the tree, you put it in the sun, it dries up. That's old-fashioned. That's 100 years ago. Today we want to make chocolates. We want to make garments. And yes, if we can, we want to make aluminum too. Thank you very much.